This is the first in a series of lectures on law and justice. Before we begin, it's important to get a few terms out of the way so we have some perspective on exactly what road we're going to walk down here and hopefully eliminate some of the misperceptions or perhaps loose definitions around some of these ideas. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the concept of morality. So let's give a definition and then talk about it a bit. When we talk about morality, all we're talking about is the quality of being that is consistent with some standards of what is right or proper conduct. So it's nothing more than a system of ideas of what's good, what's bad, what's right, what's wrong. And that's all it means. So the idea that it's a system tells you that this was created. There is no, for our purposes right now, there is no universal morality. That morality is tied to the system that human beings have put in place. And so if we as a group decide something is wrong, then it's wrong. If we decide it's right, then it's right. So morality, again, I think many people believe that it means a specific type of system of what is correct. So for many people, the idea that other nations or even just other groups might act in a way that's not consistent with the way, say, we view the world, that this is somehow immoral. Even within our own country, there could be, and there is, disagreement about what is moral and what is immoral. And over time, those things which we think of as immoral can become moral. If you think about the conduct that was acceptable within the American society going back 100 or 150 years, 200 years, or the founding of the country, it was understood that you could have this concept of, equality, but still not give women the vote. You could have equality, but still have slavery. And this was not seen as a contradiction. It was moral. It was acceptable. The system embraced it. And even though by today's standards, or even through the application of reason, if you're going to say that people are free, then you can't cut out what groups fall into or under the category of people and which groups do not. So over time, our concept of, for example, slavery goes from a moral institution to an immoral one. And there was such a disagreement, as you all probably know, over exactly what constituted a moral and immoral system, that the nation went to war, in the Civil War, to really deal with that issue. And even after the Civil War was over, and slavery was no longer seen as moral, the conduct of people in the country around the free slaves was pretty much consistent with the view that was held by many before the Civil War, which is that slaves are not people. And they were treated as such in many states in the country, obviously with lynchings and rights being violated in terms of voting, having all kinds of mechanisms, in the way that prevented people, former slaves mostly, from coming to the polls, poll taxes, literacy tests, things that you could reasonably establish as necessary for proper voting. And when I say reasonably, I mean that, an argument could be made that where we could see that it makes sense on some level that if you're going to vote, you should be able to read the ballot, let's say. Probably poll taxes would be less defensible. So obviously, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution was designed to give some force to the idea that slavery should come to an end and that people should be treated equally. But again, that morality switched. It changed. It altered itself. If you think about women getting the vote, women didn't get the vote until the beginning of the last century. Um, the idea that women would be excluded by today's standards seems totally immoral and seems pretty obvious in the face of it that it was discriminatory. But women were held in a different position than men. They were not considered equals. And when you think about many places around the world today, that's still an ongoing perception. And it's not one that is limited to only a few countries. Even in certain semi-democracies, you have women either being treated differently overtly or in some sort of structural way. If you think about the United States, a structural example would be the unequal pay that women receive for the same job that men do, or the way women are perceived when they come into the workforce as, if they're going to join the professional ranks, although it's never stated, the idea is she's considered as someone who might possibly leave after, the corporation or what have you has invested time in her because she may decide to have a family and the like. So what's moral is not universal, and it is not stagnant. It changes over time. And so people talk about morality as if it is universal. This is moral or it's immoral without really any standard for that. In other words, how do we know if something is moral or immoral without injecting our moment in time or our perceptions of the world into it? So we need first to get this idea of morality being the bedrock of a society, as if you can build an entire society on that, and that's never going to alter. As a foundation, it moves. And because it moves, it's really not universal or it's not stagnant. If you think about the right of, former slaves to attend schools, to get an education, this wasn't acceptable. So we need to begin the journey through, law and justice by defining some terms, getting some misperceptions out of our sort of minds, and then begin to structure something that gives us more insight and moves us hopefully towards a more consistent and reliable, definition of what morality is. Now, tied to this concept of morality is the concept of ethics. Something being ethical. Well, something is ethical, right, if it's consistent with the rules of conduct that are recognized, right, based on really the morality. In other words, if you act in accordance with the moral setup, the moral structure, then what you're doing is ethical, right? So basically, morality shifts and moves, and built on top of that is conduct. So if your conduct is consistent with the morality even of the moment, then you're behaving in an ethical manner. So if a woman, for example, doesn't dress a certain way or doesn't respond a certain way in a given situation, that conduct is considered not ethical and therefore is punishable in some cases under the laws that have been set up in the society, which is what morality is built on. It's supposed to reflect those things, the laws. Or it could just be mob rule, that some people have taken it upon themselves to find some other document, some other founding force upon which you can judge someone's actions. And mob rule is simply nothing more than taking into your own hands what you think is wrong and correcting it. And that could be beating someone to death in the street. So we have to get our minds around exactly what these things mean and how we're going to structure them so that some benefit will come of them. So the process we need to do here, our process is first, given morality and ethics now, we need to talk about the different types of law, natural law, common law, and the like, what they're based upon. And then eventually we're going to need to come to some sort of way of discerning if there is some sort of morality or some sort of system that makes sense in terms of our fundamental humanness, okay, if basically what we really want to answer there is there some sort of consistent morality that we could all agree on? And I would argue there is, but there's a corruption of it, and that in large measure is the problem. And then if we come to that, we have to look at how in America we actually protect that idea of morality and we foster it. Now, let me just say one other thing as a caveat here. All law is open to interpretation, and therefore all law is corruptible. And that's a fundamental problem. And that corruptibility is based not only on the way it's written, but by the way it is enforced, and of course the way it is interpreted. So no matter what kind of law we come up with, it's mutable. We can do things to it. And so the question is then, well, what do we build law on? And again, it comes back to this fundamental idea of what is moral, what is acceptable. Because moral is nothing more than a system of what is acceptable, right? And so can we come up with a system that does something that benefits in some way human beings, and that across the board would make sense in terms of how we should structure our societies and how we should act upon them? So we're going to go through a series of laws, not particular laws, but concepts, so we can see if that's the beginning, maybe, perhaps, of building a fairer structure. Now, beyond that, it's not just the unofficial corruption that we have to worry about, but official corruption, which is much more difficult to sort of dig out, to ferret out exactly how manipulative those laws are. So, for example, 72,000 pages of tax law that's written primarily by people that understand the law and can assist or help write laws that will benefit them, and oftentimes at the expense of others. And we could ask the question, for example, is it moral that people that own homes should be able to write off the interest off their taxes that they pay on their home, or write depreciation off on their home and get a tax benefit from that? Whereas people that can't perhaps afford homes or decide not to live in a home of their own that they own, but decide for whatever reason, could be financial, could be preferential, they decide that they want to live in an apartment building, but they can't write off their apartment rent. So they get no write-off. What's the basis for that decision? Both need a place to live. Why is there no benefit given to both? So you have to understand that in the writing of the law, as well as in the execution of the law, as well as our interpretation of the law, and our ability to enforce the law, we get multiple opportunities to corrupt whatever system we've put in place. And since fundamental human nature is corruptible, as it seeks its own advantage, then are we ever really going to have justice? Are we ever going to have a law upon which we can build a society? My answer to that is yes, but that we have to address the fundamental problems first of the structure and the enforcement of law and what the foundation of it should be. And we have to be willing to set up structures that are, if not incapable of being corrupt, at least in some way mitigated or controlled. And that's about the best we can do. So what we're going to be working on here is how do we come up with a perfectly acceptable, flawed system. We're not looking to come up with something that's flawless, because it's not possible. Human beings are corruptible, the structures they put in place are corrupted, and they're not just. So justice is another term another idea, concept we'll come to terms with, as well as what's law. So where we start is at sort of the beginning. Nations didn't always exist with codified rules of conduct. Here's how you must behave in this situation. Here's how you must behave in another. So the beginning really is natural law, which makes sense, right? Basically, it's just these ideas of universal moral principles. And they obviously underline ethical and legal norms, at least they're supposed to. And that's supposed to control, how people behave and how their actions are evaluated, as well as the government's actions. So natural law is important as a place to start because the idea of it, although it's derived from the Roman term jus naturale, it doesn't matter how we want to structure that. What it really comes down to is what we believe is the inherent rights of people, regardless what structure they find themselves under. In other words, is there a natural law that exists for all of us? Well, and we'll get to other aspects of this, divine natural law, secular natural law, and that sort of thing. But bare bones, is there anything that we can come up with that by its nature is absolutely moral? And the answer to that is yes, in two ways, one of which we won't get to until later. But let's think about what we have a right to do as human beings. I think we could all agree we have a right to protect ourselves from others harming us. But that's a fundamental principle of existence, right? You should be able to defend yourself. Now, as there's always, misinterpretations and applications of laws and the like, what constitutes protecting yourself? Can you kill someone that you think is threatening? Do they have to actually attempt to hurt you first? Where do you draw that line? Again, these are not scientific, by nature. I think in many respects, people think the law is sort of a lookup table. You broke this law, here's the punishment for it, and so on. And that's not the way it works. Law has to be reasoned at some point, and we'll get to that. So, natural law, yeah, the right to sort of protect ourselves. What about the right to feed ourselves? If I'm hungry and I need to survive by eating something, and there's nothing for me to eat except for that apple which you own, which you've put on your table, can I take that apple and eat it in order to survive? Well, there's all kinds of issues that come into play there. Is that apple really needed by someone else to survive? The person that picked that apple, the person that grew that apple. Do they have a right to that, a claim to it before you if you're both hungry? What about if the person that grew the apple and is going to eat the apple is not hungry? In fact, has many, many apples. Do you then have a right to take it? Or let's talk about a stream. And there are fish in the stream. And no one owns the stream, but it's governed by or controlled by the government. And it's clearly posted that you can't fish there. Now, someone is starving to death. Someone's very, very hungry. And they know that there's fish in those waters. Do they have a right to violate the government rule that you can't go and fish in that area and feed themselves in order that they might survive? Or if you respect the law to the point where you'll starve to death because you can't violate the law, is that acceptable? Is that required? In the first article I had you read, which on sort of in a tangential way tries to address these problems. Obviously, I'm going to greater depth and in terms of them, and also kind of more expansive in nature. There, the example is there's a law saying you can't cross a double, or a white line, and the question becomes, as the scenario is set up, a child runs into the street, and you cross over that white line to avoid hitting the child, and so you've broken the law. So what happens here? Do you get punished for breaking the law, or do you not get punished because you crossed over the line in order to save the life of a child? And if you've read the article, you know sort of where that goes, and we'll talk about that later on. So this idea of natural law, right, is some fundamental principles: the right to feed yourself, the right to, protect yourself, right? Are there any others that might fall into this concept of natural law? Things that, by your very existence, you have a right to. What about shelter? Do you have a right to shelter yourself from the elements? Let's just say that it's pouring rain, and you're going to get wet, and you're going to be cold. Say it's wintertime and it's beginning to rain. Do you have a right to seek shelter somewhere? What about if you go into someone's property and there's an old broken down building that no one seems to be using, but the property is posted saying keep out? Do you have a right to go into that structure? We'll say it's a barn, to get out of the elements. And how far out of the elements are you allowed to get? Can you break into someone's home because they're not there? And start a fire in the fireplace and raid the refrigerator and, cook yourself a meal. Where do those lines get drawn? So if we talk about those things which we have a right to, these universal moral principles, under natural law, even there we have a lot of things we have to sort of, move about and sort of work with to make a determination about exactly what is and what is not natural law. I mean, we can all probably agree that, feeding yourself, protecting yourself, and seeking shelter for yourself, that those are all probably, acceptable. The question is how you define those things. To what extent do you go before, you violate some rule? In other words, I have a right to feed myself, but how well can I feed myself? So I took the apple, but I noticed there's also, some sort of roast or something like that. And I said, oh, that would be good. I take that. What about some dessert? At what point do we say you have somehow, by what you've eaten, already reached the point where your life is no longer in danger from starvation, and that's where you should stop? And then why do some people get to eat so much and throw half of it out? And that's acceptable. But if you go over to their garbage to take that food out, that somehow that is not acceptable in a society. So these are very complicated issues, and even though we're trying to get to the basis of them, which is important, you'll begin to see that law is obviously not this lookup table, but requires a great deal of thought. And in the article I had you read, the question is what comes into play here? The white line, or the saving of a child's life. And the article's intent is to explore this idea of fairness, and when laws and whether or not the law itself and those that adjudicate it, what is their role in all of this? Are they supposed to just apply the law? You cross the white line, and therefore you get punished. We don't care why you cross the white line. Or is that up to a judge or jury to decide, well, in this particular case, given these circumstances, well, it's acceptable. We're going to go ahead and say that that's perfectly acceptable behavior. And what is that behavior based on? We're saving the life of a child, passing a white line. Well, suppose in passing the white line, a car is coming at you, and that car, to save the people inside, veers off to their right. And as a consequence, they go over the edge of this guardrail, and they all die. So you saved one child, but by breaking the law, and the law was written for that purpose, to keep this from happening, others have died. How do you weigh the life of a child against those others that have died? Or do you not weigh that at all? Do you just look at the intent? What was their intent? So embodied in all these different types of laws is really what people's sense of fairness is. And you'll see later on when we get to it that fairness and justice and the application of the law, all of these things are very important in terms of not only clearing up the misperceptions people have about them, but also as fundamentals that we have to address if we're going to say anything about the law at all. So natural law, we can sort of get our minds somewhat around that. But also, there's this sense that, well, there's law that goes beyond just feeding yourself, shelter, and protecting yourself. That there are laws that govern our behavior that are not of this world. In other words, there is law that is higher than any law that humans can write, that goes beyond fundamental natural law, but is handed down to us by something beyond our understanding or our control. I'm talking about divine natural law here, which is nothing more than a system, like all law is, right? And it's a system of principles. And basically, we believe that those principles were revealed, or created and revealed to us, obviously, the behavior and the like, by God, or some other being, supernatural, something that's not here, but that others believe controls our behavior or sets down rules of conduct for our behavior, right? But typically, if you look at these, it's really the structure. We'll even call it the divine structure of these religious leaders. These authoritative religious leaders, right? That say this is what the Word of God, what they've determined. Even if you believe that the Ten Commandments came down as God's divine law for all of us, those have to be interpreted. I mean, thou shalt not kill. We're talking about the Judeo-Christian Bible at this point, obviously, but thou shalt not kill. When you read that, there are no footnotes. In terms of either what is meant by it, or what circumstances under which it's considered, killing, and under what circumstances it's not. And that's basically determined, those boundaries are basically determined by, those elites in those religious structures. Now, people would argue with that and say, no, they're not. They're handed down by God. Well, that's a whole nother conversation outside the parameters of the course. But it's important to keep in mind that even if there is a God and this is exactly the Word of God, it's being interpreted by human beings who, again, are corruptible, even if their intentions are really good, that there may be a misinterpretation, or it may be acted upon within those religious structures in a way that's inconsistent with the original idea, as set forth down by God. So divine natural law presents the same problems. It goes one step further than natural law, because as you probably know, even if you have only a cursory sort of exposure to religious doctrine, that it's not just about the right to feed yourself, protect yourself, or even escape the elements, right? That divine natural law goes a step further, right? It talks about those things which are not necessary to our fundamental survival. So divine natural law takes it one step further. It's a system of principles really laid out by some superior being that others claim to be able to interpret, and then set down these rules for us to live by. And many, many, many people around the world adhere to these principles and believe in these principles and live by them day to day, and in certain cases cause a great deal of suffering to other human beings. But we'll get into that later on. Then there's also secular natural law, right? And here again, it's another system of principles, but here it's not by the Word of God, so to speak. It's basically based on the physical, and biological needs, and their behavioral laws of nature, right? As we perceive intellectually, that we use reason for. Now, this is where it gets dicey, because secular natural law, like divine natural law, they begin and they rest upon the concept of natural law, but then they move out. One towards divinity, if you will, and the other towards secular understanding or secular rules or laws of nature. So basically, it's not God here, it's human intellect and reason that are extending or embellishing upon natural law. Right? So reason here is what's required. Now, not all human beings reason alike. And so we still have the same problem. So basically what we have here is these laws that have evolved over time, taking into account the customs, the traditions, and the experiences we all have, so we adapt them. We adapt the structure